So, summer after I graduated from high school, my mom and I went to Argentina to visit my uncle and my cousins. Now, my uncle owned a Chinese restaurant in Buenos Aires. I figured I'd pick up some extra spending money for college and work there as a waitress. Now, I didn't speak Spanish, so I mostly bussed tables and had some relatively simple interaction with customers. But I just felt really strange and definitely in a bad way. Now, I worked in restaurants in America before during high school, but there was just something different about working there. I couldn't put my fingers on it. It's something about the interaction with the customers. It's not that they were rude, they were perfectly polite, but it just felt different. It wasn't until this American couple came in that I figured out what was going on. They were just so thrilled to find another American to chat with. So, we talked and, had a good time. They got the best service imaginable, of course. And then some of the other customers overheard us speaking English and figured out I was American. And then they want to tell me about all the places they visited in America. And some of them barely even spoke English, but they would gesture or convey whatever it is in their broken English. And then another table, there's a guy that just want to practice the 3 words he knew in English. All of a sudden, they start seeing me as a person. That's when I figured out what was wrong. Before that, I was completely invisible to the Argentinian customers. That experience stayed with me. I've waited tables, I've done service jobs in America, but because more Americans have worked in service industry, they treat people a little differently. You can feel the difference just in the level of eye contact people make. It's subtle. It's this idea of being invisible versus being seen by someone. It changes the quality of our daily interaction. Feeling invisible can be very unnerving and energy draining. And how little it takes for us to interact with people differently in order to really energize that interaction and have a better connection. So the topic I want to focus on today is the second half of the, now what I'm calling the unified theory of connection. The first part I've talked about before is regularity of connecting. And in episode 2 and 3, I talked about all these different ways to build regularity into your daily lives. So I would say that's the first part of building connection. Now, the second part is once you are spending time together, you want to be energizing that interaction. And what do I mean by that? So hopefully when you walk away from an interaction, both people feel more energized. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be more hyper. Maybe you're just filled with a more peaceful energy. Overall, you have more energy after the interaction than you did before. I'm going to spend some time today just talking about energizing the connection. And this is the second part of what I call the unified theory. And I know it sounds kind of grandiose, but it's just all kind of clicking in my head and I'm really excited about it. Well, a long time ago, I read this book called The Inner Game of Tennis. It's about a different way of teaching people how to play tennis. It's more like a Zen way to go about it. Rather than an instructor telling the player, now you had to step into the ball, swing your racket high, follow through, and then giving the student 10 things to think about. And then, of course, you can't keep everything in mind as you're swinging the racket. Then you end up doing a lot worse. So this instructor just, focuses on, say, just notice where your racket is when the ball hits in the court. And when people notice the right thing, they almost automatically start adjusting themselves. So maybe one reason I'm excited about it is that there are 2 things you can start noticing so that you can then course correct on your own more naturally. And the 2 things that you can notice, one is how frequently I'm interacting with people, and then also how energized do I feel. That's also something relatively easy to sort of feel. So the reason I'm excited is that there are 2 things that we can check in with ourselves to figure out, are we directionally going the right way? So in terms of energy, I just gave this example of being seen by someone, and it can be energizing to just not be invisible. And that was just an example of two strangers briefly interacting in a dinner out situation. But that carries through to important people in our daily lives. So last year, I read Michelle Obama's latest book, The Light We Carry, for a book club, actually. She talked about who light up for you when you walk into a room and how that's especially important for children, that there's someone that will light up for them. Now, I think I almost always do that for my son. So I felt pretty good about that. And then when I thought about Dan, I'm like, I think I do that pretty well too. But then on the flip side, I noticed that oftentimes he's on his laptop and he's a very focused person. He can just be kind of oblivious about his environment when he's focused on something. Since we both work from home, I don't expect him to, every time I walk into the kitchen or living room, for him to light up for me. But I did say, it'd be nice if I'm occasionally or more frequently just greeted, especially if we haven't seen each other for a while. He's like, okay, well, I'll give it a try. So sometimes now when I walk in the house, he will look up from his laptop and say, I see you, in this robotic voice, and then look down. At least it's something, right? And then we usually have a laugh about it. But my point mainly is thinking through these different ways of injecting energy into interaction. It's mostly for our own sake. It's mostly for guiding ourselves to figure out how we show up in the situation. It's not meant to be evaluation for other people. Now, I just gave an example about Dan and suggesting that he does something differently. But, if there's a little thing that you figure out could be helpful, sure, by all means. But for the most part, it's meant to just bring more awareness to ourselves, how we show up, because that's the thing we really have the most control over. In this episode, I'll list out a bunch of ways to add energy in an interaction. But before I do that, we need to talk about our base that we're working with, and that's our own energy. So in the words of one of my neighbors I interviewed, she said, feeling connected, that's an inside job. And what she meant by that is when we're feeling disconnected with ourselves, it's really hard to reach out and connect with other people. We sort of have to have some kind of base to work off of, feeling connected with ourselves and feeling somewhat energized to be able to take some of these actions for connecting with others. Sometimes it can be a little bit chicken and egg. When we're not energized, could be because we're disconnected. Then how do we get more energy to get connected if we're not even reaching out? Well, there are ways to bootstrap through that. Maybe I'll talk about in a future episode, by really connecting and understanding ourselves better. And we can also connect with nature or through an activity with our hobbies and things we do. So there are definitely things that we can do alone that can up our energy. So we're not always depending on others to give ourselves energy, but it's really helpful to have a healthy energy base to work off of. As you hear some of these examples, if it feels so daunting or overwhelming, one of the reasons why could be because you might be depleted in energy. Then it's really hard to take some of these actions. For example, if I were super depleted, just the idea of lighting up for my son when he walked in the door could be daunting, or it could feel disingenuous. It's work if I'm super depressed and then I have to somehow light up for him when he come in the door. So managing our own energy and paying attention to that, and also taking responsibility for managing our own energy, it's something to notice. So overall, we want to elevate one another's energy and boost one another's energy. But there's a little bit of difference. So we can help one another plug up our energy drains. If something bad happens, we're sort of spiraling out and just draining and bleeding energy, then it's helpful for someone to come in and stop that energy drain. So that's one way we can help each other have more energy, is just plug up that drain. On the positive side, to elevate one another's energy is another way to overall increase energy. But I kind of think about them a little differently, or I pay attention to, is it an energy drain stopping situation or just a overall general elevation situation, right? I can't quite articulate why it's important, but I just have this intuition that it is. And then maybe if I go through some more examples, it will become more clear. So, on the energy drain side, one of the patterns I noticed in my interviews is that the periods when people feel most disconnected are oftentimes periods when people don't feel good about themselves. One example was someone I interviewed was going through an eating disorder as an adult. And she's a high performing person in her late 30s. For several years, she didn't tell a soul. And she said that was the most disconnecting period in her life. So in that case, that person has a huge energy drain. Eventually, when she did confide in some friends and family, that stopped that energy drain. Even if you can't open up to a friend or a loved one, at least a therapist, the feeling of shame or guilt, it doesn't even have to be some big secret we're keeping in life. A personal example is I did this big house renovation project last year. The costs were just expanding out of control. And I started thinking, what was I doing? We had our little condo and we were minimalist. Things were fine. Why did I load up on this big stressful project? So there's definitely a bit of a guilt and shame with why did I desire this thing? And I remember when I, walking up and down the street, when I ran into a neighbor, they would be so effusive about, oh my gosh, this house is turning out so beautifully. You must be so happy while I'm here stressing out. So one time when that happened, I finally just said, look, I'm really stressing out. If there's an undo button I can hit, I probably hit it right now. So the neighbor was like, oh, you know what? I totally get it. And then she told me her big renovation disaster story. And it felt really cathartic and connecting. I didn't even know her that well. And then I started telling another friend, she never really did a big renovation project, but she told me about how I think during her maybe late 20s, her and husband were living in a city apartment and it had a rat infestation. It was just so traumatic for her. She ended up moving back to New England. And again, it was a very connecting experience as I confide in other people about my inadequacies over managing this project. So this is a whole other topic of vulnerability and opening up to others. But that can definitely stop an energy drain to have a sympathetic ear and to provide that to a friend when they're going through something, particularly something they feel a little ashamed of or feeling like they made a mistake or did something bad. Or it could be more of an everyday situation when they're just dealing with a stressful situation. So here's another example. A friend recently was mentioning a big presentation she had to do for her company. When she did a practice talk, the audience were just kind of blank. Afterwards, she was just spiraling. She felt like, oh my gosh, I have to redo this whole presentation. I don't really have the time, but I guess that's what needs to be done. But she called a friend, and after talking through with this friend, she realized that it's probably just because she's missing a step. There's a disconnect in the presentation. She didn't have to redo the whole thing. She really just have to add a piece that makes a better connection between the ideas. So in that case, alone, she would have spiraled into this place of stress and anxiety, but talking through it with a friend allowed her to see a new solution. So when something a little stressful happens to us, allowing our friend to vent and process it can help them see things in a different light. So that's another example of plugging up someone's energy drain. I think the energy boost is much easier to understand. We have fun together, we do things together to up one another's energy. So next, what I'll do is just provide a big list, a menu of 8 different things we can do to up one another's energy. So for each of these, as you listen, you can think about what would it mean to use this in an energy drain situation versus a upping other people's energy situation. And by all means, it's not an exhaustive list. So there are 8 of them. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on each one. And if you have any questions, I might in the future go through some of them in more detail. So number 1 is keeping one another company. So just being in the same room as the other person can be very up energy. On the energy drain side, when a friend is going through a really difficult period in their lives, sometimes they don't want to be cheered up. They just want to be left alone, but not left alone. They want to just be however they are, be able to show up being sad and depressed and a big lump, and still know that we don't mind being around them. Another personal example is sometimes I find a chore really unpleasant, like organizing the basement. And I would ask Dan, like, hey, can you just come downstairs, be on your laptop and keep me company while I sort through stuff? And that's helpful. Simply being accompanied by someone can be energizing. So that's number one. Number two is seeing and hearing one another. Both hearing other people and then also revealing who we are. And that can be very energizing. I talk about the Argentina example. Actually being seen in that little context can make a difference. And every day we go through our lives, there are people we don't see. And to the extent we can, if we can give other people the gift of being seen, it's a small thing, but it's just a way to practice. Next time when you're checking out at a cafe or a Trader Joe's, to actually practice seeing the person who's serving you can be good for both parties. All right, so number three is just showing one another love and appreciation. That could be in terms of hugs, words of appreciation, or even gifts. So I won't go into too much detail on this one for now. It's relatively self-explanatory. Number four is just having fun together, entertaining one another, whether it's playing games, watching movies, playing sports together, playing video games. So that one should be pretty self-explanatory. When we're having fun together, we're energizing one another. So number five is having adventures together. Now, you could argue it's in the same category as fun and entertainment, but for me, the differentiator is the fun and entertainment sometimes are not as novel or challenging, right? We're watching a movie, we're doing something where the adventure suggests something. It's a little bit more exploratory, a little more unknown, with a little bit more risk involved, and often takes more energy than fun and entertainment. When we're really flopping around low energy, or when our friends have low energy, we can always get together and watch a movie together. But going on an adventure, though, on the other hand, it really requires you to have a little bit of energy before you can undertake this one. Either that, or we have to have a different mentality around seeing things in life as adventures. I think the older I've gotten, the more I try to see things this way, rather than seeing experiences, good experience or bad experience. I just try to see all of them as an adventure. There's definitely limits to how much that mentality can be applied. I hope someday I'll be so enlightened, if I ever get cancer, I'll say, oh, we're going through this cancer adventure together. But I don't know. I don't know if I ever get that enlightened. But there's smaller things in life that we can definitely start seeing more that way. The example I think about is back in grad school. I remember Dan went on a bike trip with 3 friends. It was a weekend trip. He came back and said, oh, it was the worst ever. It rained the whole time. They couldn't even get the fire started to make some ramen noodles. On the way back, he got a flat tire, so they had to figure out how to put in a new inner tube in the rain. It was just miserable all around. But as a year passed, he started changing his tune. I remember after a year or so, he started saying, oh my gosh, that was such an adventure. If he ever see one of those friends, he said, oh, remember the time we couldn't even get the fire started? Ha ha ha, it started turning into this fun reminiscence rather than this miserable experience. So my take is that if that was going to be remembered as an adventure, why not backtrack that and start feeling that way even when we're going through those challenges? So for smaller things like that, I think having that awareness and that mentality can probably make the experience better in the spot. So that's more the adventure mindset. In practice, I think I've always enjoyed adventures, and I try to bring a little bit more of that into my life. A couple months ago, I started what I call a surprise club, just for people in the neighborhood. What surprise club is that we just plan surprise events for one another. So you're just told this is a time, this is a place, and this is a dress code. And you just show up. You don't know what's happening. And the only rule is that you have a good attitude and just be willing to try whatever the person planned. And we take turns planning events. The idea about Surprise Club is just to inject a little bit more adventure in our busy lives. So on the energy drain side, if we can better change our mindset so that when something is energy drain, we view that as an adventure, it could be helpful. But I think this one is perhaps more for the upping energy side of the equation. That's why we want to be able to manage our time, manage our energy, so that we have more tools available to connect with one another. Okay, so that was number 5, adventures. Number 6 is support one another. Now, on the energy drain side, when something difficult happens, we want to be there for our friends to provide support. So that's pretty easy to understand. But on the high energy side, sometimes it involves supporting our friends in trying to reach their goals and their dreams. There definitely could be the case when we're good at supporting other people in crisis or in need, but we can be less good at supporting other people in their dreams. And this can sometimes come up with our kids. We might be a little bit more worried if they want to become an artist or want to pursue something that we feel like, oh, they're setting themselves up for failure. Or maybe it's just cautionary. Our friend have this goal. We want to be more cautionary to them so that they don't get hurt. Yes, and is this concept in improv comedy where if one person presents a scene, for example, one person is pretending to be washing an apple in front of a sink, and she says, "Oh, I think this apple is a little rotten." And then the second person, rather than saying, "No, it's not rotten," or "No, you're not washing an apple, you're washing an orange," that can cut the scene right away. So rather than that, you accept what the other person presented and you build on it. So the second person can walk in and say, "It is rotten." And then they start pulling and pulling at the apple. It's like, oh, there's a snake coming out of it. They're building on what the person said and sort of dreaming with them and adding details. That could be a very different reaction. So supporting one another, that's number 6. Number 7 is to work on something together or create something together, meaning having shared goals or purpose. This could be someone that you share a work project with. You're building a startup together. Or you could both be volunteers for organization. Finally, helping one another directly. That's another way to energize a connection. So when we're younger, helping a friend move, carry their furniture, that's a direct way that we're helping. Connecting friends with one another or some kind of resource they might need might be something that we do now. The help could be, for example, I enjoy helping people think through their career goals or their life design. And then more recently, I enjoy helping people work on their stories. I had multiple people entering the Moth Story Slam. They will ask for some feedback on their story or do a practice run with me. That type of help is probably even more pleasurable for me than it is helpful for them. There are definitely ways to be helpful and also feel very energized ourselves. All right, so that was number 8. So that sums it up. And by all means, it's not an exhaustive list, but I think having a menu of options can be helpful when we're thinking about, well, what are the things that we can do to energize the time that we have together? I want to stress connecting or energizing, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that we have energy, we're pouring energy to other people, right? And then we become depleted. Oftentimes a win-win situation. For example, 2 people, they're both struggling around a same topic or issue. When they're together, it could become very energizing. One of the interview I conducted, a mother was talking about one of her kids with special needs, She said, when I visited this school for kids with special needs, she just felt so at home and she really connected with the other families and the teachers because they just get it. So that's an example where two people have low energy or energy drains, but together they can elevate one another's energy. And then when we're showing up for a friend who's in need and who's in a very energy drained state, we can practice how to show up better and be more loving. So that's it for today. I know we covered a big list of things we can potentially do to energize our connections. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.